Good morning, folks. Welcome to the first Water, Oceans, and Wildlife legislative hearing of this Congress. All of the bills that we're discussing today focus on wildlife conservation and have been previously introduced, most with very significant bipartisan support. These bills help protect animals and their habitats while also promoting recreation for Americans from all walks of life: hunters, anglers, hikers, birders, scuba divers, beachgoers, and zoo visitors from all over this country. They will all benefit from the legislation that we are examining today. The Access Act, H.R. 1326, introduced by my colleague Mike Thompson, welcome Mike, promotes healthy ecosystems and healthy wildlife, both of which provide great benefits to hunters, anglers, and recreation enthusiasts. It reauthorizes key conservation programs and promotes sportsmen and women's interests on our public lands. As we heard from the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership during our State of Wildlife hearing 2 weeks ago, sportsmen and women have been at the forefront of conservation since the late 1800s, advocating for policies that enhance habitat and increase public lands access. The Access Act includes provisions for wetlands, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Great Lakes monitoring and research, fish habitat, target practice and marksmanship training, the Chesapeake Bay, chronic wasting disease management, and more. Our Republican colleague, Representative Austin Scott, introduced H.R. 877, a bill that would amend the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act to modernize the funding of wildlife conservation. It would update allowable uses of funds to educate hunters and non-hunters about the role of hunting and wildlife conservation and enhance recruitment for hunting and shooting sports. Additionally, H.R. 1809, which was just introduced last week by Representative Sablon, our committee's vice chair for insular affairs, would also amend Pittman-Robertson, along with the Dingell-Johnson Federal Aid and Sport Fish Restoration Act, and it would provide much-needed parity for U.S. territories. This long-overdue fix will allow the territories to receive funds from these programs for wildlife conservation programs at the same level as states. This bill passed the House by voice vote last Congress when it was led by our good friend and former member from Guam, Congresswoman Bardile. H.R. 737, the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, introduced by Mr. Sablon, along with Representative Mike McCall. Welcome, Congressman. The ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. This bill would prohibit the sale of shark fins in the United States. It already has 170 bipartisan co-sponsors. And last Congress, it had 262 co-sponsors when it was introduced by our former colleague and chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce. While shark finning is already illegal, technically, in the United States, it's important to make the trade of shark fins illegal so that we don't support this inhumane practice abroad and we can pressure other countries to do the same. H.R. 1305, the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act, introduced by the chair of the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee, Alan Lowenthal, and Representative Brian Fitzpatrick. This bill would protect some magnificent but highly endangered seabirds. It would implement the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatross and Petrels, an international treaty signed by President Bush in 2001. The effort to join the agreements has been bipartisan from the start. President Bush transmitted the agreement to the Senate, and it stayed on the priority list of the Obama administration. Joining and implementing that agreement would elevate conservation efforts for imperiled bird species around the world, and it is past time for Congress to do this. Another bipartisan bill is H.R. 1380, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, introduced by Representative Mike Quigley and Brian Fitzpatrick. Since 1990, there have been about 300 dangerous incidents involving big cats, like lions and tigers, that have resulted in human injuries and death. The Big Cat Public Safety Act would end the ownership of big cats as exotic pets and prohibit exhibitors from allowing the public to have contact with them, keeping these majestic animals and the public safe. While we all love these iconic species, it's important to remember that they're wild animals and they shouldn't be kept as pets or treated like petting zoo animals. Last Congress, this bill was led by a former Republican member of the Natural Resources Committee, Jeff Denham. And then last, on the topic of our hearing a few weeks ago, H.R. 1568, the bipartisan Save Right Whales Act, would provide funding for research and conservation projects for the North Atlantic right whale. As we heard from Congressman Moulton, expert scientists, and NOAA Fisheries, there's a dire need for congressional action to help the roughly 400 remaining right whales and prevent their extinction. In our current diverse political climate, these bills offer us an opportunity to do something together, something bipartisan that's positive for wildlife and for our country. Let's give the American people an example that shows Congress can still make smart, common sense policy. I look forward to diving into these issues with all of you today, and I invite Ranking Member McClintock to say a few words. Then we'll hear from some of the sponsors of these bills before us, and we'll welcome and introduce our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee meets today to consider a collection of bills generally restricting the public's use of the public's land and resources. There are two exceptions which I'd note. H.R. 877 by Mr. Scott of Georgia amends the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act to modernize the funding of wildlife conservation projects. During the last session, it passed by unanimous consent from the Natural Resources Committee and passed the House by voice vote. Given its broad and indeed unanimous support in the House, it's appropriate to present it again to the Senate for consideration. H.R. 1809 by Mr. Sablon of the Mariana Islands is also a measure that received unanimous support from both the Natural Resources Committee and the full House during the last session. It's a simple matter of equity. The American territories pay into the Pittman-Robertson Fund but get limited benefit from it. This long overdue measure gives the territories equal access to the fund to which their taxpayers contribute. The remaining bills before us, unfortunately, are not supportable. H.R. 1305 ratifies an international agreement for conservation of albatross and petrels, which are already fully protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Since this is a multilateral international agreement, its proper implementation should be through Senate accession and not by adoption of duplicative statute by the House. H.R. 1326 is a collection of bills that were rejected during negotiations over the Natural Resource Management Act signed earlier this year by President Trump. The negotiations over that bill produced a bipartisan compromise, hard fought by both sides, that balanced public access policies advocated by Republicans with restrictive policies advocated by the Democrats. This so-called Access Act actually places additional restrictions on public access. A particularly objectionable provision is Title II, which gives the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service the power to act as judge, jury, and executioner in seizing private property from the public. Under current law, looting is illegal, and damaging resources is prosecuted through federal lawsuit with damages paid to the Treasury. This measure would allow the bureaucracy to, for example, seize a person's vehicle without due process and with the perverse incentive of keeping any proceeds arising from damages to the agency itself. Also before us is H.R. 1380 that inserts Congress into a long-standing turf battle between small community and family-owned zoos, represented by the Zoological Association of America, against the behemoths of the industry, represented by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, with respect to the care and position of big cats. The big business zoos have been trying for years to put their smaller competitors out of business by forbidding them to possess the big cat species. The House has always wisely refused to become a, well, no pun intended, a cat's paw in this tawdry endeavor until now. H.R. 1568 would make offshore oil exploration off the Atlantic coast virtually impossible in the name of saving the right whale. Yet in a hearing conducted by this subcommittee earlier this year, we established that the other whale populations in the North Atlantic were thriving despite seismic testing. It became clear that the difficulty of the North Atlantic right whale population to recover is because it was hunted to near extinction and now draws from a very limited gene pool. The bill does nothing to add to the right whale gene pool, but harms our nation's economy and energy independence. H.R. 737 bans the possession or purchase of shark fins in an attempt to stop the practice of killing sharks solely for their fins. Well, this practice is contemptible because of the obvious wanton waste of a valuable resource. But this practice is already illegal under U.S. law. Shark fishing is highly regulated to assure sustainable shark fisheries, and shark fishermen must already account for both the fins and the carcass of every shark landed. This bill actually mandates the shark fin be thrown away, which is the most valuable part of the shark. How ironic that it mandates what it purports to abhor, the deliberate wastage of our shark resources. It does nothing to enhance conservation, and it does a great deal of harm to the American shark fishermen. Mr. Chairman, our nation looks to the Natural Resources Committee to manage our natural resources for the sustainable benefit of the American people. Most of the bills before us today are contrary to that mission, placing burdensome new restrictions on the public's use of the public's land and resources. I yield back.
All right, I would like to welcome the distinguished members of Congress who are here to testify on the bills they've sponsored. First, welcome to my colleague and senior member of the committee, the gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands, Congressman Sablan, to speak to the two bills that he's championed, H.R. 1809 and H.R. 737. Next, we'll hear from the gentleman from California, who has long championed issues for sportsmen and sportswomen, Congressman Thompson. We look forward to hearing your testimony on the Access Act. And then finally, we'll hear from the gentleman from Georgia, Congressman Scott. Welcome back, Mr. Scott, about his bill, H.R. 877, which seeks to modernize the Pittman-Robertson Act. So thank you to our colleagues, and we welcome you to join us. Mr. Sablan, you're recognized first.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman Hoffman, Ranking Member McClintock, fellow members of the subcommittee. Thank you for including two of my bills in today's hearing. H.R. 737, eliminating the sale of shark fins in the United States, and H.R. 1809, providing priority for U.S. insular areas in the District of Columbia under both the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act and the Dingell-Johnson Federal Aid in Sports Fish Restoration Act. The Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, whose chief sponsor are Congressman McCall and I, has 177 co-sponsors to date. 12 states and 3 of the insular areas have already passed legislation banning the sale of shark fins. Numerous corporations, including UPS, Amazon, Disney, Hilton, Grubhub, have policies in place to block the trade in shark fins. Even China's 3 state-owned airlines are all on board. And of course, the legislation is sponsored by leading environmental and animal rights organizations such as Oceana, the Humane Society Legislative Fund, Animal Wellness for Action, and the Animal Welfare Institute, and by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Why does this legislation have such broad support? Because every year, as many as 73 million sharks are being slaughtered for their fins, just for their fins. The Chamorro and Refaloas people, the indigenous cultures of the Mariana Islands, have made their living from the sea. We would never have wasted what we harvested. Perhaps because of that tradition, the Marianas was one of the first U.S. jurisdictions to ban shark finning. The shark fin ban before us today, which I introduced in 2014, is based on that Marianas law. The ancient Chamorro people of the Marianas understood that ultimately all life depends on the health of the oceans. And as we all understand today, the health of any ecosystem is dependent on its top predators. Yet sharks among the ocean's top predators are today at risk. As a representative sample of the scientific literature, I ask unanimous consent to add to the record a 2013 statistical analysis from the journal Marine Policy titled Global Catches, Exploitation Rate, and Rebuilding Options for Sharks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Researchers estimate that as many as 6% of all sharks worldwide are killed each year. This exceeds the average rebound rates of under 5% and explains why shark populations are in decline. As lead author Boris Worm of Dalhousie University in Halifax observed, protective measures must be scaled up significantly in order to avoid further depletion and the possible extinction of many shark species in our lifetime. That is what my bill does. It bars the sale of shark fins in our country, and by doing so reduces demand for shark fins worldwide. By reducing demand for shark fins alone, we force wiser use of our ocean resources, protecting their ecological and economic value for us all today and for those to come after us. I ask for this subcommittee's favorable support of H.R. 737. My second bill on the agenda, H.R. 1809, also aims to restore wildlife and also has bipartisan support. In fact, the bill passed the House in the last Congress by unanimous consent, though the Senate failed to act. Introduced previously by our former colleague from Guam, Ms. Madeline Bordallo, the legislation simply gives the insular areas and the District of Columbia the same base funding as states under the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts. This is like the changes to the Land and Water Conservation Fund that Congress approved in February and the President signed into law on March 12. Pittman Robertson and Digo Johnson support a variety of conservation, education, and recreation programs at no cost to taxpayers. I ask for this subcommittee's support of H.R. 1809, and I hope we will all be able to move both H.R. 737 and H.R. 1809 quickly out of the committee to the floor for consideration. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan. The chair now recognizes Congressman Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, thank you for hearing my bill today, and thank you for the opportunity to allow me to testify on the important and the lasting effects on the programs contained in this legislation. As a former co-chair and a current member of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, I feel a particular sense of responsibility towards those of us who hunt, fish, and enjoy the outdoors. I'm a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman. It's a responsibility that we have as members to ensure the right of everyone in America to use and enjoy our natural resources on the public lands that belong to each and every one of us. There's a long and proud tradition of conservation by some of the most committed and responsible natural resource users, the hunters and the anglers amongst us. Today, this bill honors that conservation ethic. For the past 30 years, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act has supported over 2,000 projects throughout our country, carried out by more than 3,000 collaborators. The result so far has been 25 million acres of rehabilitated and restored wetlands, which are fundamental to ecological health and species diversity. The Access Bill reauthorizes NACA to continue this critical work on our nation's wetlands. H.R. 1326 also includes the Resource Protection Act, which allows the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to seek compensation when anyone intentionally harms or destroys resources on any of our natural wildlife refuges. The service would then have the money to restore or replace what it was that was damaged. The National Park Service already has this authority. My bill corrects that inconsistency on behalf of Fish and Wildlife Service. Access includes 2 chronic wasting disease provisions to address what could be the most serious threat to deer, elk, and moose populations and big game hunting that we currently face in North America. These CWD bills provide the resources that states and tribes need to manage and research this fatal disease, and directs agencies to work together to find a way to keep CWD from continuing to affect both wild and captive herds. The provisions in this Sportsman bill, H.R. 1326, are intended to work together to strengthen our ability as a nation to conserve our natural resources. I'm glad that we as a Congress were able to come together in a bipartisan way and pass S-47, the important lands package just signed into law 2 weeks ago. I'm proud that S-47 includes Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent reauthorization and provisions to improve access to federal lands and encourage greater public involvement in wildlife conservation. The Access Bill builds on the important provisions in S-47 to further provide critical legislation for the benefit of our natural resources. Again, thank you to the committee for the opportunity to speak and for your consideration of this important legislation.
Thank you, Congressman Thompson. The chair now recognizes Congressman Scott for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing me to speak today at your hearing. As a lifelong sportsman, as well as my colleague, Mr. Thompson, current co-chair, I'm the current co-chair of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. Honored to be here today to discuss H.R. 877, the Modernizing the Pittman-Robertson Fund for Tomorrow's Needs Act. If enacted, H.R. 877 will provide national broad-based support to state fish and wildlife agencies to develop, guide, and enhance collective efforts to recruit hunters and recreational shooters, all while continuing to protect the natural resources we enjoy. As you're aware, through a system of user-pay public benefits, Pittman-Robertson is the foundation of wildlife conservation funding in the United States. Since it was first enacted in 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Fund has collected over $8 billion from hunters and recreational shooters to be used by states to fund wildlife conservation efforts, habitat acquisition, and management, public access to lands, hunter education, and shooting ranges affiliated with hunter safety programs. These funds are collected from an excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment, and are matched by the states with funds from licenses paid by both hunters and recreational shooters. Effectively, Pittman-Robertson creates a direct link between those that hunt and participate in sportsman activities and the health of the resources needed to expand and enhance those opportunities. However, in recent years, the increasing urbanization and suburbanization of our population has made it more difficult for the public to participate in hunting and recreational shooting. Correspondingly, the average age of the American purchasing a hunting license is steadily rising. This has a significant ripple effect not only on the key federal funding models that support the conservation of fish and wildlife, but also on the base of support for our public lands and on thoughtful natural resource policies. Without a federal mandate or any license in existing or any increase in existing user fees or taxes, H.R. 877 will preserve the current user pay public benefit funding of wildlife conservation for generations to come, while further expanding the flexibility of the states to make decisions that are best fit for them. Specifically, H.R. 877 would clarify that a purpose of the Pittman-Robertson Fund is to extend public relations assistance to the states for the promotion of hunting and recreational shooting. H.R. 877 would also expand the multi-state conservation grant program by providing an additional $5 million per year from archery tax collections for making hunter and recreational recruitment project grants that promote a national hunting and shooting sport recruitment program. This legislation simply provides the authority for the existing funds to be used on programs that will help ensure participation in hunting and recreational shooting, thus securing the funding base long into the future. It's important to note a couple of things about H.R. 877. It does not mandate how PR funds must be spent. The discretion to determine the amount, if any, of wildlife restoration funds spent on hunter recruitment and recreational shooter recruitment activities would remain directly with the state fish and wildlife agencies. Conservation organizations and state wildlife agencies alike have long advocated for increased flexibility with Pittman-Robertson funds. This bill held wide support in the 115th Congress. As noted before, it was ordered to be reported by unanimous consent by the Committee on Natural Resources on May 8, 2018, and later passed the House by voice vote on September 12, 2018. It's now more important than ever to provide state and territorial wildlife agencies the flexibility and tools needed to recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters and recreational shooters. In doing so, not only will we create a sustainable base of sportsmen and women in future generations, but we will ensure that funding for wildlife conservation will keep pace with the demands of our increasingly urbanized national population. Again, I'd like to extend my sincerest thank you to the subcommittee and the chairman and ranking member for allowing me to present this legislation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. The chair thanks our colleagues for their presentation, and we will now welcome up the second panel. And I would ask unanimous consent that the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, be allowed to join the committee at the dais. She'll be introducing one of the witnesses. Without objection? No objection, Mr. Sablon? Okay. Mr. Sablon consents to this. So our first witness will be Mr. Nick Pinizzato. He's president and CEO of the National Deer Alliance. He will be testifying on the Access Act and the Pittman-Robertson bills. Next will be Grover Norquist. He is the president, of course, of Americans for Tax Reform. He'll be testifying on the Access Act as well. And next we'll be joined by Linda McCall, who is here in some pretty good company today. She is an oceanographer and a geologist. She's worked for the Naval Intelligence tracking submarines, Soviet submarines. She has developed a biological warfare course for the CIA. Not only is she an avid scuba diver, but she's chased sharks all over the world, I am told, to study them, including great white sharks, scalloped hammerheads, whale sharks, tiger sharks, great hammerheads, bull sharks, and Galapagos sharks. She'll be speaking to the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, of course. Mr. Sean Geehan of the Sustainable Shark Alliance will also be testifying on the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act. And then for the next witness, I want to invite my colleague, Ms. Jayapal, to introduce that witness.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, for having me here. It truly is an honor to be able to introduce someone that we're very proud of in my district, my constituent, international albatross and petrel conservation expert, Edward Melvin. Mr. Melvin has dedicated his career to the conservation of endangered species, namely seabirds, such as the albatross and the petrel. His expertise and passion plays an invaluable role in supporting the next generation of conservation leaders as an affiliate professor in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington, headquartered in my district. In his nearly 30 years at Washington Sea Grant, Mr. Melvin's expertise in marine fisheries management, seabird biology and distribution, longline fisheries, and collaborative research have contributed to solving seabird conservation problems and prevent seabird mortality in fishing operations. Mr. Melvin's impressive resume and extensive list of peer-reviewed publications certainly warrant the myriad of awards that he has earned, including the NOAA Sustainable Fisheries Leadership Award for Science, Research, and Technology in 2006. So, Mr. Melvin, we thank you for your dedication to the conservation of endangered species and for your contributions to this committee hearing. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for allowing me to introduce him.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Melvin. You got by far the best introduction of any of the witnesses. Last will be Ms. Carson Bearlock from the International Fund for Animal Welfare. She's joining us today to speak about the Big Cat Public Safety Act and the Save Right Whales Act. So, let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. This is all pretty intuitive. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. At 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on, and your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I'll ask you at that point to wrap up. I will also ask the entire panel to testify before we begin questioning the witnesses. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Pinizzato for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and the members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Nick Pinizzato. I'm the President and CEO of the National Deer Alliance, and our mission is to serve as the guardian of wild deer conservation and our hunting heritage. Deer hunting was an essential part of my childhood in rural Pennsylvania. More than just a hobby, deer hunting connected me with my family, and it continues to give me a lifetime of memories. I was 14 years old when I harvested my first buck, and I can still recall the details of that morning vividly. It brings a smile to my face when I remember how proud my dad and uncle were, and I can't imagine where my life would have led without deer and deer hunting, and I'd like to ensure that same type of future for my son. I'm convinced that almost every hunter has a photograph or a story from the field that they can relate to, and I'm certainly no exception to that. Chronic wasting disease is the most significant threat to the future of wild deer populations, deer hunting, and the hunting industry. It's a neurological disease that affects deer, elk, and moose, and infected animals become emaciated and exhibit abnormal behavior, including lack of fear of people, stumbling, and loss of bodily functions. CWD is 100% fatal, and there is no known cure. The disease is highly contagious, and the infectious agent known as prions may be passed in feces, saliva, blood, and urine. Research suggests that infected prions can also bind to soils and vegetation where they believe they can remain for years, so other animals can contract the disease even after an infected animal has died. CWD is currently known to exist in 26 states, with some areas in the U.S. having a nearly 50% prevalence rate. State wildlife agencies are increasing monitoring and surveillance, which is coming at the expense of other important wildlife programs due to lack of funding to address the disease. The disease is creating significant challenges for the future of deer hunting and wildlife conservation. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, about 70% of hunters pursue deer. Deer hunting alone generates almost $40 billion to the U.S. economy each year, and it represents nearly 60% of total hunting expenditures. CWD also threatens the American model of wildlife conservation funding. From 2011 to 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reports that hunting participation declined by 2.2 million, bringing the total number of hunters down to just 11.5 million. More specifically, big game hunting participation dropped by an approximately 20%, and over the same time period, hunting-related expenditures reportedly dropped nearly 30%. There's no doubt that CWD has impacted the decision of many to quit hunting deer. yet deer hunters are carrying a significant burden for managing all wildlife. It's easy to see what a continued decline in deer hunter numbers would mean for overall wildlife conservation, including management of at-risk species. Another challenge posed by the disease is that hunters are either uninformed, misinformed, or simply do not want to believe that CWD is a problem. While state and federal wildlife agencies and several conservation groups have been working hard to provide the best scientific information, some with impactful communication platforms have been working to portray the disease as a hoax or trying to greatly minimize its importance. This has caused management strategies to be significantly slowed in some states and even stopped in others altogether. Unfortunately, as CWD surveillance and monitoring efforts and associated costs increase, it diminishes the funds available for states for management of other critical wildlife and habitat conservation work, which are already borrowing from other programs to deal with the disease. Knowing the location and extent of CWD is also vitally important. Learning more about the way the disease spreads will inform targeted research that may help determine which areas of the country are at most risk. It will also help state wildlife agencies set effective regulations to help manage it. As I described earlier, a decline in hunters means a decline in both license sales and funds derived from the Pittman-Robertson Trust Fund that primarily pay for the cost of state management of all wildlife. As detailed in my written testimony, I'd like to also mention that broad coalition of conservation organizations support H.R. 877, the Modernizing the Pittman-Robertson Fund for Tomorrow's Needs Act. With no new taxes, this bill simply provides much-needed flexibility for state fish and wildlife agencies to use Pittman-Robertson funds for outreach, communication, and education activities, and would allow states to focus strategic efforts on the recruitment and retention and reactivation of hunters and shooters, also referred to as R3. The growing concern about CWD has certainly not helped the effort to implement successful R3 initiatives. The combination of a documented spread of the disease and the spread of inaccurate or misleading information has people on edge, including hunters who are already casual participants in the activity. The collective hunting and conservation community considers PR modernization flexibility as essential in stabilizing finances for state wildlife agencies tasked with conserving fish and wildlife into the future with constricted budgets due to dwindling hunter participation. As a reminder, this bill passed through the Natural Resource Committee by unanimous consent and by voice vote in the House floor in the 115th Congress. It's simply the right thing to do and the right time to do it, and I urge you to pass PR modernization. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pinizzotto. The chair now recognizes Mr. Norquist for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Grover Norquist, I serve as president of Americans for Tax Reform. We try and keep the cost of government down to somewhat reasonable level, $4 trillion. We're not doing our job. I'm here to speak against 1326, H.R. 1326. Congress just passed, House, Senate, President signed the Natural Resources Management Act, which tremendously increased both spending and reduced access on federal lands to citizens. What's in 1326 is a list of things that Congress on a bipartisan basis said shouldn't be done. And so while the Natural Resources Management Act was bipartisan and an agreement by the majorities in the House and the Senate, and the President signed it, this is a list of things that didn't fit into that category and recommend themselves not to be done. Now, I realize that most of the overspending that Congress does is on automatic pilot with mandatory spending, but discretionary spending, earmark-looking spending, are the broken windows of budget abuse. If we're not taking care of smaller amounts, $900 million is a smaller amount, I guess, it's unlikely that the rest of Congress or the administration are able to focus on the bigger picture as well. So even though it's a small, relatively, amount of money, I would urge, one, that there be an offset. I know there's no offset to this spending. And one of the challenges when Congress passes a bill and says we want to pay for this is very important. Well, if it's very important, is it more important than anything else in the budget? No, there's no offset. There's nothing else in the budget that's less important than this. This is the least important thing we could think of. If this is more important than anything else the government is doing, what are the things that we could not do? What are the things we could have as an offset? And I think it would be very helpful if you're considering this additional spending after the last bill as well, that there be an offset to protect taxpayers from increases. Also, this really kind of looks like a series of offsets. These are targeted, these are regional, these are not national questions. That's the kind of problem that we've had in the past when particular special interests move in and pass national legislation, which really deals with questions of regional or local effect. Worse, this is an attack on property rights and an attempt to extend the obscenity of civil asset forfeiture, which I hope this Congress is finally going to get rid of at the national level, to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and to put all of the problems we now have with police stopping people's cars and deciding they think they want to take their stuff, and they do, without going through courts or actually having a trial. This would allow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, not allow, I think it's very unfair what Congress, states, and local governments do to policemen when they put themselves in the ridiculous position of saying you can take people's stuff without a trial. Oh, and by the way, you get to keep it. That is not fair to do the police. It's not fair to do the Wildlife Service. Yes, it's wrong what they're doing, but they are put in a ridiculous position where the incentives are all wrong for taxpayers, all wrong for people who own cars or are going to have something you can steal when they're on federal property. If somebody's damaging federal property, there are courts, there are laws, this is what we do, and one can go through this. This specifically is, no, we don't have to go through the law. Let's get rid of the rule of law and people can just take other people's stuff. It is my hope, having worked on criminal justice reform with Republicans and Democrats over the last 15, well, on this issue, 30 years, but more recently with the new effort to restrict and civil asset forfeiture, that we not add to that problem and getting the poor people who work at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the same difficulty that we put policemen when we ask them to take stuff without a trial, without a conviction, without rule of law. So, one, it's a lot of money. Where's the offset? Is this really the least important thing in the entire U.S. government? If it isn't, there should be an offset. If it is the least important thing, why are you doing it?
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. Do I take it that you're yielding?
Should I say that? I'm yielding. I'm done.
All right. Thank you, sir. Mrs. McCall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, H.R. 737. This is a bipartisan bill. There are 176 co-sponsors, and it is no cost to the taxpayer. It does not prohibit shark fishing, and it enables the U.S. to be a leader in shark conservation. My name is Linda McCall. I have a master's degree in oceanography. I have chased sharks all over the world, and it is a phenomenal hobby. I take my kids diving all over the world to look at the sharks. My best story is being on a boat in Guadalupe Island, and the captain of the boat said that Peter Benchley, the author of Jaws, was on that boat many years before he died, and his biggest regret in life was writing Jaws because it villainized a majestic creature in its natural environment. I am passionate about shark conservation. This bill will protect sharks and stop the import and export of shark fins in the U.S. The demand for shark fins is driving shark populations down to unsustainable levels. Every year, up to 73 million sharks end up in the global fin trade. NOAA reports that only 18.75% of shark populations in U.S. waters are sustainable. Thankfully, the U.S. has banned the inhumane practice of shark finning, catching a shark, cutting its fins off, and dumping the carcass back into the ocean to drown and bleed to death. But it still happens. Healthy oceans depend on sharks. If we kill too many of them, it upsets the food chain and ultimately the entire coral reef system. There are 12 states and 3 territories, including the Mariana Islands, Samoa, and Guam, that have banned the shark fin trade, including my home state of Texas, California, and Hawaii. In 2016, our Texas governor signed a bill similar to this one into law. However, in 2017 and 2018, fins were exported out of Texas to Mexico, China, and Hong Kong, violating our state law. Because state laws have not halted the illegal trade of fins, there is a need for a federal law that applies to all 50 states. making enforcement a reality. Banning the shark fin trade is the right thing to do from a humanitarian and a conservation perspective. It also makes sense from an economic point of view. For example, in Florida, shark-related tourism generated more than $221 million and created over 3,700 jobs in 2016. In the same year, the U.S. shark fin industry exported less than $1 million worth of fins. The entire shark fishing industry in the United States is incredibly small, 0.1% of the value of all U.S. fisheries. The U.S. should be the leader in banning the shark fin trade within our borders. When we lead, other countries follow, like halting the trade of ivory and rhino horns. We can show the world that we will no longer contribute to the demand for fins or participate in the trade, which is driving the decline of sharks. This ban is supported by states, airlines, shipping companies, corporations, scientists, restaurants, chefs, and hundreds of thousands of your constituents, not to mention both Democratic and Republican legislators. This bill will benefit the entire oceanic ecosystem, and it doesn't cost a dime. I'm asking for your support on this very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. McCall. Mr. Guillen, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee. My name is Sean Guillen, representing the Sustainable Shark Alliance, a coalition of domestic shark fishermen, dealers, and processors. We appreciate this opportunity to explain why the shark fin sales ban proposed by H.R. 737 is a far less effective tool for promoting global shark conservation than the Sustainable Shark Fisheries and Trade Act, H.R. 788. There's no daylight between the supporters of these two bipartisan bills in terms of the need to end the abhorrent and unsustainable practice of shark fishing. Not only cruel at waste, an important source of low-cost protein that can feed growing populations, nor is there any division over the need to promote sustainable shark fishing globally. Overfishing of any marine resource is a losing proposition that sacrifices much larger yields over the long run for short-term profits. We all, I believe, support sustainable fisheries for the economic, social, ecological, and human benefits they provide. In terms of sharks, the debate here today, and the question ultimately before this Congress, is how to best achieve our common goals. The theory behind banning trade in shark fins in the U.S. is that it will disrupt the global fin trade, set an example for other nations, and prevent American consumers from perpetuating cruel and ecologically harmful fishing practices abroad. Proponents often point to the ban on the sale of ivory as a model. In the case of ivory, however, the U.S. represented some 10 to 15% of the global market and importantly was not a producer. The U.S., however, accounts for less than 1% of shark fin consumption and is a net exporter of fins. Nor was the ivory ban effective as African elephant numbers have continued to decline. A U.S. fin ban will be equally unsuccessful. Sustainably sourced fins from our well-managed fishery will be replaced by those from bad actors. Only American fishermen abiding by the world's strictest shark conservation laws and sharks in unmanaged waters will suffer. What the domestic shark fishery, most leading shark scientists, and a coalition of environmental groups, zoos, and aquariums support instead is an approach that leverages the power of the U.S. market to export the best management practices of our country. H.R. 788's certification program is modeled on very successful programs to prohibit shrimp imports from nations that do not use turtle excluder devices or fish products caught using methods that harm marine mammals. These programs are supported by individuals and organizations on both sides of the shark fin ban question. Rather than hope other countries will not only ban the fin sales, but also see the light in terms of shark conservation, the Sustainable Shark Fisheries and Trade Act requires nations wishing to import not just shark fins, but shark ray and skate meat, shark oils, leather, and other products to meet the same high management standards that U.S. fishermen are required to meet. As such, H.R. 788 directly impacts a broader array of trade and fishing practices around the world than does the fin ban alone. It's frankly puzzling to me why all the groups that support these other programs have not rallied around the same approach for shark conservation. I'm afraid the reason is because the true objective of at least some is to end the domestic shark fishery. And make no mistake, passing H.R. 737 will end directed fishing on large coastal sharks. Clever drafters of the Texas shark fin ban realized if they required shark carcasses shipped into or through the state to have the tail and fins attached, they could halt the sale of shark fins in other states. Since Texas and Mexico are big markets for domestic shark meat but not fins, this law has caused a 90% reduction in large coastal shark catches in the western Gulf of Mexico so far this year. Some may cheer this development, but growing shark populations are rapidly increasing natural mortality on such important food and game fish as red snapper and groupers, not to mention increasing predation on whales and marine mammals. Management authorities are beginning to take note. In closing, there's nothing inherently wrong with the cultural practice of consuming shark fins. There's more than a small amount of cultural insensitivity in demonizing this tradition as opposed to focusing on the real issues of animal cruelty and overfishing. The fin ban fights yesterday's battle as shark meat is now driving overfishing. H.R. 788, by contrast, is a proven approach supported by the Coastal Conservation Association, American Sport Fishing Association, Dive Equipment Manufacturers Association, Wildlife Conservation Society, the AZA, and Mote Marine Laboratories. That is a proven approach to addressing our common concerns. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Guillen. Mr. Melvin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today in support of House Bill 1305. My name is Edward Melvin. I work at Washington Sea Grant at the University of Washington, where I specialize in seabird conservation and commercial fisheries. Albatrosses and petrels need our protection because they have a vulnerable biology and they are ocean wanderers spending most of their lives at sea, coming to land only to breed. Because they are long-lived, more than 60 years, begin to breed late at 4 to 13 years of age, and produce a single egg every year, every other year, adult mortality as low as 2 or 3% can trigger population decline. Albatrosses travel throughout the world's oceans, some navigating the globe between breeding events. Although these birds face a host of threats at their breeding colonies, primarily from introduced predators, and more generally from climate change and plastic ingestion, mortality in fisheries is the most serious threat. Estimates of seabirds killed in longline fisheries alone number in the hundreds of thousands every year. Practices to prevent fisheries mortality are well established. However, few fleets have adopted them, and where they are required, fisheries are poorly monitored and conservation measures are rarely enforced. Of the 22 albatrosses, 15 are threatened with extinction. Given their vulnerability and distribution across many fishery jurisdictions, a coordinated international effort is absolutely essential to assure that these birds are protected. The Agreement on Conservation in Albatrosses and Petrels provides exactly that. Currently, there are 13 parties to the agreement. I participate in the agreement's Seabird Bycatch Working Group, whose role is to develop best practice advice to prevent seabird bycatch, which fishery governing bodies are encouraged to adopt in their fisheries. The North Pacific albatrosses, black-footed, Laysan, and short-tailed, are among the 31 listed as ACAP species. They breed on colonies in the Hawaiian Islands as well as on islands off Japan and forage throughout the North Pacific Ocean, including U.S. waters. The short-tailed albatross, once thought extinct due to harvest on their breeding colonies, is listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Black-footed and Laysan albatrosses are classified as species of conservation concern by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. is a world leader in developing and applying conservation measures to protect seabirds in our North Pacific fisheries. In Alaska longline fisheries alone, I estimate that over 170,000 fewer birds were killed, including 11,000 fewer albatrosses following the implementation of streamer lines, a seabird avoidance technology, over the last 17 years. However, U.S. fisheries are not working on a level playing field with regard to other fleets. Most of all non-U.S. fleets fishing in the North Pacific do not employ conservation measures to protect seabirds, and fisheries monitoring is poor to non-existent. I encourage this subcommittee to support H.R. 1305. As the 14th nation to join the agreement, the U.S. could lead by example and use its considerable status and leadership to level the playing field by encouraging other North Pacific nations to protect our North Pacific albatrosses by also joining the agreement and adopting seabird conservation measures. The U.S., already a powerful voice in international fishing policy, would be well positioned to advocate for worldwide adoption of seabird conservation measures. Although the U.S. already participates in the ACAP process, by joining the agreement, the U.S. would have a seat at the table for decision and policy making and allow U.S. representatives and experts to hold positions of leadership. Further, joining the agreement could lead to consistent and reliable resources for U.S. representatives and experts to participate in the agreement process and our federal agencies to augment and maintain their capacity for seabird conservation work both at sea and on seabird colonies. In summary, I'm convinced that only a coordinated international effort as afforded by the agreement can ensure these vulnerable ocean wanderers survive extinction. I encourage you to support H.R. 1305 and allow the U.S. to become a party to the agreement for the conservation of albatrosses and petrels and bring our considerable status and experience to the international effort to protect these amazing animals. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Melvin. Ms. Barlock, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today on behalf of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, or IFAW. I will be speaking first in support of the Big Cat Public Safety Act, followed by the Save Right Whales Act. IFAW has long advocated for ending the private ownership and unscientific breeding of captive big cats, and has put words to action by aiding in the rescue of 118 big cats across the U.S. Tigers, lions, and other big cats are wild animals that should not, under any circumstances, be kept as pets. These dangerous animals are often kept in small spaces that are entirely inconsistent with their needs, and rescue operations have demonstrated the extreme abuse enabled by the pet big cat trade. Mickey, a pet cougar, was in such poor condition when rescuers saved him from a backyard enclosure that he was not expected to survive. Untreated, severely torn ligaments in his back legs left him largely immobile, in severe pain, and very underweight. After multiple surgeries and extensive veterinary care, he was able to engage in some natural behaviors again, but the devastation of his time as a backyard novelty left him with permanent physical limitations. A leopard held on the same property from which Mickey was rescued was not so lucky. The leopard had been placed into the same enclosure as a large dog and experienced severe injuries, which were left untreated. The leopard succumbed to these injuries after at least 2 years of suffering, during which she was observed with open wounds and bones protruding from her skin. Unfortunately, these are just a couple of examples of the horrific conditions that pet big cats endure across the U.S., and most will not be rescued. Even for those that are saved, U.S. sanctuaries, which undertake incredibly resource-intensive rescue operations and absorb the astounding costs of caring for big cats long-term, are only a bandage to a problem that ultimately demands a federal solution. Big cats also suffer when they are used in pay-to-play or photo op displays. Exhibitors who profit from allowing people to handle cubs drive intensive breeding to feed the constant need to produce new cubs. These young animals are most profitable for just a few short weeks of their lives, which can be up to 20 years. After their usefulness disappears, they are often left to live out their lives in extremely inhumane conditions or are killed. In one case, more than 90 dead tigers, including 58 cubs that had been stuffed into freezers, were found abandoned by the operator of a California cub handling business. Keeping big cats as pets and exploiting cubs for profit also threatens human health and safety. Numerous pathogens can be passed between big cats and people, and there have been hundreds of dangerous incidents involving captive big cats across the U.S. It is not only the owners who are at risk. First responders are generally not trained or equipped to deal with these wild animals, but nonetheless must put their lives on the line when dangerous incidents occur. This places an unreasonable burden on both law enforcement officials and taxpayers. Accordingly, the Big Cat Public Safety Act has been endorsed by the National Sheriff's Association, public health experts, and first responders across the U.S. The trade in U.S. captive big cats also hinders conservation of the animal's wild counterparts. It contributes to interstate and international trafficking of these species and the State Department has acknowledged that weak regulation of this domestic trade is hampering America's ability to advance big cat conservation abroad. By strengthening existing law to prohibit public contact and limit the trade in pet big cats, H.R. 1380 will bring us closer to ending these threats to conservation, animal welfare, and public safety, and it is our hope that the subcommittee will swiftly approve this important legislation. I'll now turn my attention to the iconic and highly imperiled North Atlantic right whale. Fewer than 415 of these animals remain, of which fewer than 100 are breeding females. The species could be functionally extinct within 20 years unless significant action is taken. Today, right whales face a multitude of threats in Atlantic waters, but ship strikes and entanglement in fishing gear are the primary causes of mortality. Between 2010 and 2015, entanglement caused 85 of diagnosed serious injuries and mortalities, and 83% of the population has been entangled at least once. Upon becoming entangled, some whales drown, while others suffer serious injuries and infections, and still others slowly starve to death. IFAW understands the urgency of addressing this crisis and has been working with the fishing industry on pilot testing of ropeless gear, along with other technologies aimed at eliminating entanglements. But further innovation, collaboration, and resources are needed. The Save Right Whales Act would provide a sustained source of federal funding for collaborative research and other activities to reduce entanglements, as well as vessel collisions. This bill is supported by fishing industry leaders like the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance, as well as scores of scientists. We ask the subcommittee to expeditiously approve H.R. 1568 to give these whales the best chance for survival. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you to the witnesses. We will now begin questioning from the members, and the chair recognizes Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today to share your thoughts and your expertise as we deliberate on these bills. Mrs. McCall, thank you very much for what you do, and probably for some of the dinner conversations you have, and that Congressman McCall is a lead co-sponsor. We are major sponsors of H.R. 737. And if I may ask, of the bills introduced in this Congress that focus on shark conservation, why do you think the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act would be the most effective in halting the dangerous depletion of the shark population?
First of all, thank you for your question, and thank you for sponsoring this bill. The reason that this bill is the best bill is because it doesn't cost the taxpayers any money, and it makes law enforcement across all state lines easier for law enforcement. It's a fact that the demand for shark fins is driving shark populations down. And NOAA has said that the populations at 8.75% are unsustainable. And when we change the shark in the water, it changes the entire oceanic ecosystem, and it messes everything up. So I think that this bill not only is the best thing for the taxpayer, it's the best thing for the authorities, and it's the best bill to conserve sharks. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, growing up, we'd go fishing, reef fishing primarily, and we'd come across sharks, and they have this habit of actually preferring to chase the fish that we already caught rather than go chasing it on its own. So we just, you know, bought their face, and they'd move on. When we get to see a shark that's like 4 or 5 times larger than I, then we call it a day, actually. But why do you personally invest your time and resources in shark conservation? So can you speak to us about some of your experience diving with sharks with your family, actually, and what they mean to you?
I'm not afraid of sharks. I think that they're majestic creatures. I've been in the cages with the great whites. I've taken my kids in the cages. I've gone down to Cocos Island and seen hundreds of schools of hammerheads. these are just majestic creatures, and I personally have a huge hobby in tracking them. I've tagged sharks in Belize to look at their migration patterns. I go for personal enjoyment, and this is economically good for all countries, really, because there's a huge industry, a huge economic industry to look at sharks, and it creates jobs. And you will find nobody in the shark industry or the scuba diving industry that would not be for this bill.
Okay, and you mentioned that you've gone on tagging missions, so I guess across the world, but I'm especially interested in the Pacific Ocean where I represent. What is the status of shark populations in general?
Well, within the U.S. waters, NOAA has said 18.75% of shark populations are unsustainable. And I think it's very important that we start looking at that issue. Sharks go everywhere, all over the world. It's really hard when they start getting into currents to be able to track them. That's why we put these transmitter devices on them. Thank you.
Mr. Grover, I just have one question for you. HR 1809 and 737 are no-cost mandates, actually. You don't oppose these two bills, do you?
737 bans the shark trade in shark fins?
Yes, sir. They have no cost to the taxpayers.
Well, if you ban something that's taxed, you do have an effect on taxpayers ultimately, but HR does not have a position on that piece of legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Pinizotto, did I get that right?
Yes, you got it right. Thank you.
Pittman Robertson provides federal funding derived from excise taxes on sporting equipment, for wildlife restoration and hunter education, and my time is up, but Dingo Johnson provides funds for sports fish restoration, aquatic education, wetland restoration. So could you agree with me that it is important for the U.S. insular areas to receive state equal funding considerations for both acts? Yes or no?
I think it's important to hear the concerns of both the states and the territories on that matter, and that's something that I can certainly do and get back to you with more information on.
I appreciate that, sir. Mr. Chairman, my time is way over. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Norquist, I want to start with Title II of the Access Act, because I find that rather offensive myself. Under current law, if someone is charged with damaging public property, Fish and Wildlife Service has to file a lawsuit, go into court, and the burden of proof is on them. Under this law, as I understand it, Fish and Wildlife, and by the way, if they are assessed a fine for doing damage, that fine goes to the Treasury, a disinterested third party, rather than back to the agency that's leveling the charges. Under this act, the agency that levels the charges also seizes property without due process, and any proceeds that are assessed against the individual stays with the agency that leveled the charges and enforced the charges. You have a problem with that?
There's been a problem with that since the Romans did it. It's called tax farming, and it resulted in most of the revolts in Rome. The idea that the people who collect assets, a tax, keep it, leads to exactly the wrong incentives. And when you take property without having gone through a court system, if you find somebody guilty of something and fine them, then you can take some of their cash. But to seize property, this is a problem we have all across the United States. It's gotten increasingly problematic. Civil asset forfeiture, which is something we ask our police to do, and then sometimes the police, the county sheriff, gets to keep some of the cash to spend as they wish, not to go through the legislature. The idea of taking that kind of resources outside of Congress's appropriation process, I would think Congress would find repugnant and unconstitutional. period.
I think the American people would too. And now, ironically, this
no, they object to having their stuff
access.
stolen. You guys object to who decides how to spend it.
They call this the Access Act. What kind of message does that send to Americans trying to access their public lands?
It's access to your property by the government.
Just
it doesn't increase access to anything, as far as I can tell. This bill tends to limit access.
I just also wanted to touch on the beneficiary pays principle, over which we run most of our resource programs. The beneficiary pays for the program, the taxpayers then are left off the hook. You'd mentioned that major provisions of the Access program are not funded through beneficiary pays, but rather simply tap the taxpayer. And since most of these are regional issues, you end up robbing St. Petersburg to pay St. Paul. Which form of funding do you support on behalf of taxpayers?
It is less dangerous to have something that more approximates a user fee. I think historically, the legislation you're talking about has sometimes been abused. They tax people who buy a gun for home defense and the money gets spent in a national park. I'm not sure that's quite a user fee. People who decide to wear Patagonia because it looks cool end up paying for people who go fishing. So it's not quite a user fee the way that gasoline taxes are until they start stealing it and putting it into metro systems, but it's closer
if I could,
than
Mr.
general revenue.
My time's running out. Mr. Gian, your livelihood depends upon sustainable shark populations, does it not?
Well, since I work with the commercial fishing industry, yes.
Well, we're told that this is no cost to taxpayer. What cost is it to the commercial fisherman?
I think what Mr. McCall's getting at is that the agency would have to run a certification program, but I don't think would require any additional agency resources to do that. We have met with the people in international affairs.
We're told the shark fishing industry is incredibly small, so we can just squish it. Is that essentially your view?
Well, it had been much larger. You know, management came in after the government worked with the industry to develop
there seems to be
the industry, but
it
is very important.
There's a recurring theme here with several of these bills. You know, you're a small industry, folks struggling to make ends meet, doing it responsibly and sustainably, take on this world of environmental advocacy and get squashed in the process because you're incredibly small. At the same time, we have the cat bill that is specifically aimed at the small zoos. It is opposed by the Association of Small Zoos. Their term is the Zoological Association of America. This has been a recurring theme before this committee. We have always resisted it in the past. Big guys against the little guys, and little guys end up on the losing end, apparently, under these bills now before us. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record testimony from the director of the Office of Sustainable Fisheries at National Marine Fisheries Service, Alan Riesenhoover, on April 17, 2018, where he addressed this issue and testified that the certification program that's being discussed would entail very significant costs. Without objection, that is entered into the record, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Huffman. I appreciate you holding today's hearings on these bills. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I look forward to working with you to pass these common sense measures that will protect wildlife and give Americans greater opportunities for recreation. I share our witnesses' concerns about the challenges facing our nation's wildlife. The loss of biodiversity is one of the most urgent environmental issues today. Many species are threatened by human-related impacts, including habitat destruction, invasive species, disease, and climate change. Congress, and this committee in particular, must continue to work towards protecting wildlife at home and abroad if we hope to preserve biodiversity for future generations. In particular, I'd like to thank Mrs. McCall for your leadership. I'm proud to support and co-sponsor the Shark Fin Elimination Act. You know, many of us on this subcommittee come from states or territories that already have shark fin bans, including my state of California. But I was disturbed to learn from your testimony that despite having a ban, that there's still active importing and exporting of shark fins. And for example, my state of California, we evidently had over $500,000 worth of imports of shark fins in 2017, despite having a ban in place. So I wanted to ask you, how would a national fin trade ban help stop this practice?
Thank you for your question. It's very simple because the federal government can talk to the states. Right now, there is a lack of communication with the federal government and the states. So say, for example, Texas or California, we don't find out because NOAA's not talking to us until after the fact when the fins are gone. And so in order to have everybody talking and have everybody on the same sheet of paper, we need to have a federal law that applies equally to all 50 states.
Makes sense. I'm really grateful again, Mrs. McCall, for your leadership on this bipartisan bill, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly associate myself with the remarks of my colleague just prior. Wish I had copied your testimony and given it again, not your testimony, but your questions, but thank you. And fully concur with the questions as to shark fin banning. Hawaii was one of the first at the state level to do that. Senator Schatz led that effort a long time ago. And I certainly think that that effort needs to be broadened out into a national effort as well. I'd like to focus, Mr. Melvin, on your testimony having to do with the Albatross and Petrel Act, the proposed act. In Hawaii, of course, my home state of Hawaii actually extends all the way through the northwestern Hawaiian Islands up to the island of Midway. A lot of people don't know that, but it includes the home to about 98% of the Laysan albatross, as well as many of the seafaring birds. And what I'm particularly interested in your expounding upon in the time that we have is how the enactment of this bill would assist with our international conservation efforts for these species, part of the biodiversity that my colleague just spoke very well to. In particular regard to the fact that, as I understand it, none of the Pacific nations is a party to the international agreement right now, and because the primary cause of mortality of these species right now is longline fishing fleet, we are fully dependent on voluntary efforts from countries like Japan, like Taiwan, like some of the other countries that fish the middle Pacific, where these species roam because they are seafarers. How exactly can you please just further describe your testimony as to why passage of this bill would assist our efforts to obtain international cooperation with countries that do not now participate in that agreement?
Well, thank you for your question, Congressman. I think this bill would allow, it would give us a platform to, beyond the ones that we already have, to engage with the countries that you described that don't use these conservation measures. And it's really important, as you point out, because they don't stay, these birds don't stay in U.S. waters. So the fact that we cannot blunt the bycatch of these birds and other fisheries undermine all the conservation efforts that we pursue in the United States. And by joining the agreement, we demonstrate leadership in the North Pacific, and it really gives us a platform to extend our expertise that we've developed in collaboration with industry, I might add, to encourage them further, and I think would lure them into joining the agreement. And the other thing,
how exactly? I mean, how does that play out? Can you just, you know, we can't force them into the agreement, but what is the practical effect if we're in this agreement, and we of course are a major player in the North Pacific, as are a lot of other folks. We have a long-line industry which is feeling disadvantaged from the current situation, or would if we were part of this. How do we actually get these other long-line fleets of other countries to you know, cease their ignorance of this threat to these species?
well, directly through diplomacy. We have several channels, and in a way, I do it myself. I engage with scientists in Chinese Taipei, in Russia, and Japan. I'm part of an international working group, the recovery team for short-tailed albatrosses. So we engage with these folks. I engage with the scientists. I've gone to different countries to give presentations to encourage commercial fishermen to use mitigation measures and to convince them that this is important. So I think what it would do is give us more leverage to make that argument, because by not joining, we're not supporting the international effort.
Let's say that I'm sorry, my time is coming up, so let me just ask you this question. Let's say that we actually enact this law, and we are part of this agreement. Can we then say to those countries, demonstrate that you are participating in the enforcement, even on a voluntary basis, before you can land at our harbors? Can we go to that extent to leverage this situation?
The technical aspects of that I'm not sure I can address. Most of the landing, the actual landing of fish, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't really happen in the lower 48, I believe.
Certainly land in Hawaii.
They are landed in Hawaii. Yeah, exactly how we could go about that in terms of trade, I really can't address. It's not my expertise.
All right, thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes, myself. Ms. Barlock, the Canadian government has been ramping up survey efforts and resources to protect the North Atlantic right whale. Do you believe the same could be said of the United States?
Yes, but certainly more research is needed. More research and innovation are needed. Of course, these animals have cross-boundary conservation challenges, and the Save Right Whales Act would basically help us raise our efforts to the level of Canada's.
All right, so I'm hearing you say that the current research and monitoring efforts in this country are inadequate.
Yes.
Is that fair to say? Thanks. Mrs. McCall, I'm so glad to be considering this bill as the author of the California shark fin ban a few years ago when I was in the state legislature. And I just want to address a comment about the bill, the competing bill that is modeled after the shrimp import rule. I note that the United States imports about $6 billion in shrimp. Shark imports, I believe, are just over $500,000. And so what I want to ask is whether you think countries will actually change their management in order to access such a minuscule market in the United States, or whether trying to model after that shrimp import rule may be impractical.
I think that the NOAA testimony that you all had 2 years ago or last year, it was pretty clear that the certification program was very expensive. And with that all came lawsuits and people that were saying that even in the shrimp industry with the turtle exclusion devices, it was very, very hard to certify that. And that was a very narrow the other bill is very broad, and it can't be certified without a lot of money at the taxpayer's expense. And even at that point, NOAA said that even if they made it a lot narrower, it was still very, very hard in order to certify that. It is true that the shark industry is very minuscule compared to the shrimp industry. And because the sharks are having a population decline, it is our duty to put shark conservation laws and measures in place for the entire ecosystem.
It's been noted that technically shark finning is illegal in the United States, and yet we continue to import shark fins. We continue to be a vector for the illegal shark fin trade. This means that we're dealing with countries that have lax or no protections in place for sharks, and I wanted to ask if you think it sends a mixed message for the U.S. to nominally outlaw shark finning while continuing to be part of this problematic illegal market.
I think that if we ban shark finning, then other countries will follow. And we've already heard testimony today that China is opening their eyes, and I think that we need to be a leader in banning the shark fin trade. And I think that Other countries will follow.
All right, thank you. We've heard that the ban on the shark fin trade will cost the taxpayers nothing. A competing bill that's been mentioned would be costly. There's testimony from NOAA about the significant cost of establishing that program. Serious questions about the effectiveness of implementing that program. Mr. Norquist, a lot of people around here across the aisle look to you as the oracle of fiscal restraint. I realize you have no position on the shark bills, but you've been sitting here listening to this debate. Let me take this opportunity to ask you, all things being equal, would you prefer Congress address the shark finning problem with a bill that costs the taxpayers money or one that doesn't?
We ban drugs. That doesn't make it costless. I'm not sure that prohibition is less expensive sometimes than even overregulation. But again, I'm very interested in looking at the two bills. ATR does not have a position on it. I worry it does seem to be targeted at certain ethnic groups, so it just seems a little bit iffy to me in general.
All right. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Neguse for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this important hearing. And regret that I wasn't able to hear from some of the witnesses today. We had a conflicting hearing over in judiciary. I wanted to talk about the Access Act in particular, and Mr. Pinizotto, I hope I pronounced that right.
Pinizotto, close.
Pinizotto, all right. Well, it's Congressman Neguse, so it's a tough last name myself. I represent the state of Colorado. The 2nd Congressional District includes many of our national parks and some incredibly beautiful places in the country. And I believe in your written testimony, I suspect probably in your the testimony presented as well, you discussed chronic wasting disease in deer and other species, the fact that it's spread to 25 states. And indeed, my state, Colorado, happens to be one of those. Colorado was one of the first, if not the first, state to identify chronic wasting disease in our wild cervid populations. And so I just would appreciate if you could kind of describe the impact that this disease is having on hunters, but also on outdoor recreation in general.
Sure. On hunters, there are a lot of impacts. I think one of the big challenges is that we've been losing hunters. I don't think that's any secret. But this disease makes that even more of a complicating challenge because people are now concerned about it. They hear what the disease does to deer. They're afraid to eat deer now because of the concern of transmission to humans, which, by the way, has not been proven to be true, but it's a concern. And I think the other thing that happens is that it becomes very inconvenient now for people to hunt deer in some areas because there are special restrictions in place. So, for example, we have regulations in place where in many states you're not allowed to bring a deer in from another state, at least certain parts of that deer, so people now have to process it more thoroughly than they might have otherwise. So that creates challenges. And also to have a deer tested for chronic wasting disease, which is something that we encourage, now requires it's a more complicated process for the average sportsman to send an appropriate sample in, and then they must wait sometimes a couple of weeks or longer to get a result back. Much different than the tradition of hanging the deer in the back and maybe processing it yourself or just taking it to a processing facility. So that's challenging, certainly to hunters, and makes it difficult. And to the states, your state recently just published a CWD management plan, which is very well done, one of the first states in the country to do that. It's very challenging because monitoring and surveillance of this disease is critical. We need to know where it is. We need to know how it's spreading. And right now, states are having to rob from other programs in order to pay for that monitoring and surveillance. So this bill provides hopefully some funding for them to be able to do that and not rob from other programs. As I mentioned in my testimony, deer, in a lot of ways, big game hunting pay the bills for all wildlife conservation. And therefore, the more we lose hunters, the more we lose people buying the implements they use to pursue deer, the more funding we lose to deal with this disease. So it's very challenging that way as well.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
All right, thank you. I believe the ranking member would like to be recognized to enter some things into the record.
I just, Mr. Chairman, ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 letters from Fish and Wildlife managers from Florida and Louisiana opposing the Shark Fin Trade Elimination Act.
Without objection.
I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the director of Mote Marine Laboratory Center for Shark Research, Dr. Huter, to Representative Don Beyer, which debunks many of the myths that we heard today regarding the shark fin legislation.
Without objection.
And did I understand the chair has already received unanimous consent to enter into the record the NOAA testimony of April 17, 2018 regarding the Shark Fin Act?
Correct.
That, I believe, is the testimony that says we cannot support the Shark Fin Sale Elimination Act because the bill's negative impact on U.S. fishermen would outweigh its minimal benefit to shark conservation. So I applaud the addition of that testimony into the record as well.
Very good, and I will ask that we enter into the record testimony of the Trump administration's Interior Department to the Appropriations Committee, in which they advocate for the Resource Protection Act, including that same asset recovery feature that was discussed earlier, so that when our wildlife refuges and federal properties are damaged and vandalized, we can recover those costs for the taxpayers. Hearing no objection, that'll be entered into the record. And we have arrived at the end of this hearing. So I want to thank all of our panelists. Where's my closing script here? Thank the witnesses for their testimony. Certainly thank the members of this committee. They may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and so we will ask that you respond to those in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.